Hi, I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast, episode number 14, Like a Moon Rising, where you never thought you would see a moon. Today we're going to plunge into a story called The Water of Life, a story that in many ways is a manual for getting yourself out of a tight place. We begin with a kingdom that is right now, a kingdom that is forever, a kingdom that is the body and a kingdom that is the soul. It is a real place, it is across the street, and it is 1,000 years old. And in this kingdom, there was a king, and he was very old, and one day he became sick. And he continued to get sick. And all the wise men of that kingdom and the medicine women of that kingdom came to his bedside. And they consulted the stars. They consulted their own dreams. They looked at the king, examined his body, and they all concluded that soon he would die. Now this king, he had 3 sons. And when they heard this news, they went to the palace garden, and they sat beside a fountain in that garden, and they began to weep. Now who is it who hears the weeping of young men? Who is it who hears the weeping of young women? Who hears that sound? Who has the time? Who has the moment in their lives to hear that sound and then to act? In this story, there was an old man in that garden, and he heard the weeping of the 3 sons of the king. And he went to them and stood beside that fountain, and he said, "Sons of the king, why do you sorrow so?" And the eldest said, "Our father the king is very ill and soon will die." And this old man said, "I have heard of something called the water of life. No one knows where it is, for it exists somewhere beyond this kingdom. But if you can find it, it will heal any illness." So the old man went off. And the eldest son said, "I will find this water of life." And he left his brothers and began to walk towards the palace, and then through that palace to the royal bedroom. And as he walked those hallways, in his heart he thought to himself, "If I succeed in this, Father will give the kingdom to me." So he arrived at the royal bedroom, and there was his father stretched out on a bed of pain. And he spoke to his father and said, "I wish to find the water of life, for that will heal you." Did his father say yes? Is that the kind of kingdom we're in? Absolutely yes. No, we are not in that kind of a kingdom. We are in a kingdom which is stuck fast in a world of stone. And the old king said, "No, do not do this. I do not give you my permission. Remain here. Let me die in peace. I don't want to lose you out there in the dangerous world." But the eldest son argued and he pleaded. And finally, the old king gave his permission. So the eldest son got on a good strong horse, and the gates of that castle swung open, and he galloped out into the forest. And he rode straight and he rode true. He did not swerve from the direction in which he was galloping until he came to a part of that forest where he'd never been before. Strange, twisted rocks, tall trees, the jagged cries of mysterious birds filled the air of that place. Still, he galloped straight and true through that wild forest. And after a while, he passed a large boulder covered in lichen. And out from behind that boulder, there stepped a small dwarf-like man covered in hair. And he said to the eldest son, "Where are you going, son of the king?" And he said, "None of your business, you little twerp." And he kept galloping. After a while, he came to the edge of that forest, and he entered a realm of sand and of gray rocks. He could see mountains far ahead. He galloped straight towards those mountains. Before long, there were mountains ahead of him and to either side. Before long, he was in a canyon that was getting narrower and narrower. Before long, he found himself in a place where he could not go forward and he could not go back. And he could not even get off his horse. And he was stuck, just like someone in jail. So, back at the castle, no word was heard about the oldest son, and everyone gave him up for dead. Well, time moved forward as it does. Days became weeks, and the oldest son did not return. So the middle son said to himself, "I will do this. I will find the water of life and bring it back. And if I succeed, Father will give the kingdom to me." So he went to the royal bedroom, because this is a kingdom where you must ask permission. He went to that bedroom. There was his father, weak as a cobweb on that bed. And he asked permission to go find the water of life. Did his father say yes, absolutely? No, he said no. "Do not go. I do not want to lose you as I lost your brother. Remain here. Let me die in peace, surrounded by my family." Well, the middle son pleaded with his father, and he argued, and finally, the old king let him go. So he too got on a good strong horse, and the gates of that castle swung open, and he galloped out into the forest. And he galloped straight and he galloped true, and he also soon entered parts of that forest where he'd never been before. The jagged cries of the birds were in the air. The trees were taller and shadowier than any he'd seen before. And he too came to a large boulder covered in lichen. And suddenly, out from behind that boulder, there stepped a small, dwarf-like man covered in hair. And he said, "Where are you going, son of the king?" "None of your business, you little twerp." So the middle son rode right past that hairy little man, and went through the forest, and soon he entered a realm of sand and gray rocks. And before long, there were mountains ahead of him, and he rode towards those mountains, and before long, there were mountains on either side of him, and before long, he was in a narrowing canyon, dribbling away, getting thinner and thinner, narrower and narrower, and finally, he was in a place where he could not go forward, and he could not go back, and he could not even get off his horse. So, in the castle, no word was heard about the middle son, and people gave him up for dead. Days became weeks. The king remained ill on his bed of pain. The medicine men and the medicine women brought herbs and medicines of all kinds, but these things had no effect. Finally, the youngest son said to himself, "No one is left to do this. I am the only hope for our father." So he walked through the hallways of the castle towards the royal bedroom. And then he arrived and saw his father stretched out on the bed. And as he saw him, he remembered being carried on his shoulders when he was a boy, and how his father would take him outside into the long grass outside the castle and show him the stars at night and tell him all the stories that went with the stars, so that it was a sky blazing with fire and filled with stories. He remembered that moment now as he looked at his father, an old gray man withering away on a bed of pain, and his heart was filled with sorrow. And with love and sorrow in his heart, he spoke to the old king and asked permission to go find the water of life. And the old king said, "No, I don't want to lose you as I have lost your brothers. Stay here. Let me die in peace in this very room." But the youngest son pleaded with his father. And finally, the old king gave his permission, and off the youngest son went. Now he got himself a horse, but it was not as good a horse as his brothers had had. Still, it was a horse, and the palace gates swung open, and he rode out into the forest. And he did not ride straight and true. In fact, he wandered this way and that. He had no idea where he was going. He went this direction, that direction. He wandered through that forest. But soon enough, he found himself in a wild place there where he'd never been, where the trees were more shadowy, and the cries of the birds were like tangled but beautiful music in the air. And he rode past a tall boulder covered in lichen, and out from behind that boulder there stepped a hairy little man, about the size of a dwarf, and he said, "Where are you going, son of the king?" And the youngest son stopped his horse. He got off his horse, and he said, "I'm trying to find the water of life, because my father the king is very sick and soon will die. Do you know where this water of life can be found?" And the dwarf said, "In fact, I do. In fact, I know exactly where that water of life is to be found." And he gave the youngest son exquisite and flavorful directions to that place. "You go here around these 3 willow trees, and then by an old river which remembers its source high in the mountains. And then you'll come to a hill that people call the Bump of the Ancients. And then you go to this, and you find a haystack, and this, and through here, and this, and that." And he told him in delicious detail the way to the castle holding the water of life. And he said, "You will come to a meadow filled with long grass, and you will see at the end of that meadow a castle that will look as if it's made of smashed moonlight. But you will never get into that castle without this." And he pulled from his bag an iron rod, the color of dried blood. And he said, "Take this, my friend. Go to the gates of that castle, knock 3 times on those gates with this iron rod, and then they shall open. Now, as soon as you enter this castle, you will be confronted by 2 ferocious lions, one on the left and one on the right. What you must do is give them these." And he pulled 2 loaves of bread from his bag. He said, "Toss these into the mouths of those ferocious lions, and they will be satisfied, and you will be able to enter that castle. But be careful. There are many snares inside that castle. But if you are true, if you are careful and aware, perhaps you may succeed." "Thank you," said the youngest son. "Thank you." And he got on his horse and he galloped away. Now he had remembered everything the dwarf had said. So he began to follow those flavorful and exquisite directions. And he found the 3 willow trees. He found the hill known as the Bump of the Ancients. He found the river that remembers its source high in the mountains. He followed all these directions. And he rode for a short time or for a long time. Some say it was days. Some say it was years. For time is a river that doubles back on itself and that has strange pools and eddies. And sometimes 5 minutes is a century, and sometimes a century is 5 minutes. But on a day that was ending in a flourish of pink and orange light in the west, as the sun was going down, he came to a meadow filled with long grass. And he tied his horse to a tree, and he looked across that meadow, and indeed, he saw a castle that seemed to be made of smashed moonlight. And so he walked across that meadow, through the long grass that whispered around him as he walked. And as the sun went down, he came to the great gates of that castle, which seemed to be made out of iron bear claws. Huge and old they seemed. It looked like they had not been opened for many, many years. And then he took the iron rod from his cloak, and he knocked it 3 times on that gate with a great thunderous clanging sound. And just like that, the bear claws unlatched themselves, and the gates of that castle swung open. So carefully, and with an alert mind, he stepped into that castle, holding the bread, and he looked to the left, and there was indeed a lion there, getting ready to pounce, but he threw that bread through the air, and it landed in the mouth of that lion. And he looked to the right. There was no lion. Where was the other lion? He looked around, this way, that way, whirling around. Behind him, on a high balcony, there was the lion. He threw the bread through the air. Whew, it went into the mouth of that lion. Now these lions were used to eating sheep and deer, all kinds of live animals. They had never tasted anything like the delicious cinnamon taste of this moonlit bread, this bread filled with the magic of the sea and the mountains and the high clouds that are all ice that move through the high skies of this world. It was magical bread. They were interested in this bread. They began to gnaw and chew on this bread with great relish. And then the youngest son looked around. He was in a courtyard. It was open to the sky. The pink light of the setting sun was still in the sky. And this courtyard was filled with statues. He stepped forward. He went to the statues to look at them. They were statues of kings and of princes. They were all statues of men, young men and boys. And then, as he went very close to one of these statues, as he found himself looking at the eyelashes of one of these statues, a chill went down his spine, like old lightning. And he realized, these are not statues. These are people who have been turned to stone, people who were alive and breathed and sang and laughed and cried. And now they've become so stuck, so clogged that they have become stone, and their lives are over. Carefully, and with fear in his heart, he walked between those frozen men. And at the end of that courtyard, he came to a stone table, and on that table there was a luminous blue sword. Without thinking about it, he picked up that sword and put it in his cloak. And beside that sword there was a loaf of bread. He could smell it. He touched it. It was still warm. It was like it had just been baked. And again, without a thought, he picked up that bread and put it in his cloak as well. And then he stepped through a door and into the castle itself. And in the next room there was a princess, just walking towards him, out from behind some green curtains. And she had an expression of delight on her face. And she said, "Welcome, stranger, welcome to this castle. We have been under a spell for so long. And now this spell is halfway broken because you have come to visit us here." The water of life which you seek is just ahead, just a few rooms away. But be careful. You must obtain that water and leave this castle before the clock strikes 12. Otherwise, you will be enchanted and frozen in this castle for all time. But if you succeed in these tasks, you may return to this castle in 1 year. And then, if you wish, you and I can reign over this kingdom as king and queen. Now be careful and hurry." And she squeezed his hands, kissed him on the cheek, and disappeared behind the green curtains. Well, this was a lot of information. His head was all in a whirl. A year, king and queen, water of life, 12 bongs on the clock. What did it all mean? He couldn't sort it all out, but he just walked away from that room and through a doorway into another room. And in this room there was a bed covered in a gold quilt. He looked at that quilt. It was fascinating. There were pictures on that quilt. He could see a raven stealing the sun. He could see a bear swimming across an ocean. He could see a woman in a tower with long golden hair dangling down the side of that tower. He could see a sword that was bleeding. All these pictures from all kinds of stories from all over the world were on this quilt. He was fascinated by them. He was also very tired. He had ridden a long way. He'd been traveling for a long, long time. Would you sleep in that castle? As listeners to this story, would we sleep? Well, we would do better, of course. But if we were in the story, that would be something different. To be outside a story is one thing, to be inside it is another. And all of us are inside a story. And so he lay down and closed his eyes, just for a little rest. And before he knew what was happening, he had drifted off into a deep and restful sleep. A sleep like music sung by mountains. So he dreamed and he slept. And then he was awoken by the sound of a clock ringing 1. He stumbled up. Where am I? What's going on? The clock struck 2. He looked around. I'm in the castle of the water of life. I have to find that water. The clock struck 3. He ran into the next room. There was a fountain there, filled with beautiful, luminous, shining water. The clock struck 4. He went to that fountain. He pulled a vial from his cloak, a pocket of his cloak, and he leaned down to fill it up with that water. The clock struck 5. He filled it up with that water. It was shining and luminous. He got the cork from his pocket. The clock struck 6. He dropped the cork on the ground. It was rolling around. Where's the cork? Oh, where's the cork? The clock struck 7. He found the cork, picked it up. He jammed it onto that glass vial. The clock struck 8. He ran from that room into the next room with a golden bed. The clock struck 9. He ran from that room into the room where he'd met the princess. The clock struck 10. Then he ran into the courtyard. The clock struck 11. Past the stone table, he sprinted between all the frozen statues. The clock struck 12. He could see the gates closing, the bear claws flexing their muscles to latch onto each other. He leapt through the gap between those 2 gates, and he landed outside in the dew-kissed grass, holding the glass vial with the water of life to his chest as the gates slammed behind him, and as they slammed, they took a big chunk out of his heel. And he looked up, and the stars were out. And in that moment, he remembered seeing those stars with his father when he was a boy. And then he gave a big sigh of relief, and he stood up and walked through the long grass to where his horse was tied to a tree. He patted his horse, gave it some oats, and lay down in the long grass to sleep. And night came and filled the sky with 1,000 stories, stories told by the light of stars. And in the morning the sun rose, and the birds took up their first songs. It was real. He had the glass vial containing the water of life. He looked back. The castle was still there. The long grass was there. Everything had happened just as he remembered. And then he got on his horse, and he rode away from that meadow and through the forest. But he had not gone far when he passed an old tree covered in moss. And out from behind this tree there stepped a small, hairy, dwarf-like man, and he said, "Where are you going, son of the king?" And the youngest son said, "Ah, the dwarf, I'm so glad to see you. Thank you for all the wisdom you gave me, all the knowledge. Without you, I never would have made it into that castle and back out again. Look, I found a magic sword. I found a loaf of bread which looked like it had just been baked." And the dwarf said, "Be careful with that sword. It is very powerful. With that sword, you can defeat entire armies. And be careful with that bread as well. It is also very powerful. Numberless amounts of people can eat from that bread, and it will never run out. Thank you, said the youngest son. Thank you. Now there's only one thing I am wondering about, only one thing I wish to solve, and it is this. I wish to find my 2 brothers. Where are they? Do you have any idea how I can find them and bring them home to our castle? And the dwarf said, Your 2 brothers are exactly where they should be. They are exactly where their thoughts and the ideas and the feelings of their hearts have led them. They are right where they should be. Oh, but I so long to see them again. Can you please do something to return them to me and to our castle and our kingdom? And the dwarf closed his eyes and whispered words that could not be heard. And then he opened his eyes and he said, You will find your brothers if you ride to the southwest. There is a meadow there. They will be at the far end of that meadow on their horses. But I tell you, beware, for your brothers have evil in their hearts. Oh, thank you, said the youngest son. Thank you. And he got on his horse, and he rode off through the forest. And he went southwest, and before long he indeed came to a meadow, and there at the end of that meadow were his 2 brothers. And they were looking a little confused. They looked like they'd just woken up. And they were glad to see him, and he was glad to see them, and he spoke, and he said, Ah, my dear brothers. And they said, Where have you been? And did he keep secrets? Did he tell lies? Did he make up a story? No. The youngest son told them everything. He told them every detail of his adventures. How he'd spoken with the dwarf, how he'd been given the iron rod and the loaves of bread, how he'd found the water of life and met a princess in that castle, and how, if he returned in a year, he should be made king of that realm with her as his queen. Interesting, said the older brothers. Very interesting. It's good you tell us all of these things. And then the 3 of them set out, galloping through the forest, back towards their kingdom and their father, who was lying on a bed of pain, very ill. All right. Thanks for listening to this story. Some stories go up and some go down. This one starts out going down. Right away, we have a sick king. We've got that beautiful image, that beautiful setup right at the beginning, like a poem. A kingdom with a sick king and 3 sons who hear this news and go to the palace garden and they weep. So we've got sorrow right away and sickness and weeping by the palace fountain there in the palace garden. And the old man comes and tells them about the water of life, which is not in this kingdom, but will cure any illness. If you imagine that kingdom as yourself, as a person's soul, their individuality, who you are, that's the situation. The king, the ruler, the one who makes decisions, the ego, we might say, the boss number 1, the captain of the ship, the one in charge of who you are and your personality and yourself. That self is sick. And then you've got these 3 sons who hear about it and weep. And the cure that you need is outside the kingdom. It's outside yourself, somewhere out in the world. You got to go out there. But does the king let you go? No. Well, he does, but not after a fight. It's such a beautiful picture of a place, of a situation of the soul where you were stuck, or I am stuck, where any of us could be stuck. We're clogged up. We have certain ideas about how the world works, and they have worked for us for a while, but suddenly they don't work, and things dry up. And sorrow is the way to reconnect with the waters which can bring change and a new flourishing, a new blossoming, a new springtime to this kingdom. As always, I invite you to connect with this story in any way possible for you, whatever feels best for you. One way in is to think of an image which grabs you. And for me, it's that opening with the three sons at the palace garden, at the fountain there, weeping. And then, of course, we go on from there, and the older brothers follow the plan. They go straight through the forest. They're strong, they're tough, they go straight, yes. You could bring gender into this story. Now, of course, it speaks to all of us, but we could say the male part of ourselves, the yang part. You know, in Chinese philosophy, you've got yang and yin. Yang is the sunny side of a hill, yin is the shady side of a hill. It's that simple. But yang and yin go on to include all kinds of things. Shadows on one side, light on the other, male and female in a way. All of us are a blend of these tendencies. That's understood very well right now, where we're at in history, in this world, in the West. That truth is understood, that all of us encompass both male and female in some way. Still, you can listen to this story, and it seems to be speaking. The male side seems to be what is sick. There must be a queen in this story, but she's not mentioned. We could say that's a weird patriarchal move, like they don't care about queens. That's possible, of course. There are such stories, but most stories know what they're talking about, and when they forget something, it's on purpose. And there's plenty of stories with queens. There's a million stories with queens, but this one doesn't even mention a queen. Likewise, when we get to the palace, it's the enchanted palace of the Water of Life, it's men that are found in statues. So, of course, it's possible we're just excluding women, but I don't think so. I think this is more a story about a sickness that comes to the male part of ourselves, whether you're a man or a woman, that comes to that active part of yourselves, the yang side, the side that is out there in the world getting stuff done, blah, blah, blah. The part of you that listens to music, that writes poetry, that remembers your dreams, the part of you that has feelings and is in touch with those feelings. We could call that your feminine side if you want. We could call it the yin side. The darker, shadowier, more secret, thundercloudy, watery side of yourself, of any of us, that side is simply not present in the beginning, or it needs to be contacted through the palace garden, through the fountain there, through weeping, of course, through tears. The whole story is a dialogue between stone and water, in one sense. And we begin in the realm of stone, and we are stuck so tight. And then the sons get stuck in stone, of course. How perfect. Their rigid ways bring them to a rigid place where they can't get off their horses. They can't go forward or back. They get stuck. So I don't think that's a accidental omission, that the queen is not mentioned. I think this is largely a story about a sickness of the active side of ourselves, the accomplishment side of who we are. And so for that reason, that's the way the story proceeds. And then we get them stuck in the stone, and then we get the castle, the magic castle where the Water of Life is to be found. And of course, it's this youngest one, as so often in stories, the youngest one who least believes the company line, perhaps, who has least taken in the wisdoms of that family. Wisdoms which are true wisdoms, right? Wisdoms that must have said, ride on a good horse, go in straight lines, don't be turned back. Determination. There are other stories where those qualities are required. That would be a different kind of story. But in this one, those qualities have gone too far, and they need to be tempered by grief, by sorrow, by tears, by feeling. And that wonderful moment when the youngest son acknowledges how lost he is. The others are afraid to say it, probably. They're scared to admit they don't know where this water is. And they also don't want to acknowledge a little person, small, low to the ground, someone who sees things they do not, up there on their high horses. The littlest one gets off his high horse to speak with the dwarf. So that's the knowledge we need, the kingdom needs in this story, the low-down knowledge, the watery, grief-stricken knowledge that will save the kingdom. In my own life, I think of A ton of examples, really. I was a Boy Scout as a kid. We had a Boy Scout leader, and he would not let go of the troop. It sounds like a silly thing in this day and age. This is a while ago, but it was true. He had led that troop for years. There had been many Eagle Scouts. He was a military man. He'd been in the military, as many people have. And he had an iron grip on that troop. And he got older, and he started to fail. He couldn't keep the records for that Boy Scout troop. The finances were getting chaotic. Decisions that should be made weren't getting made. Boys would earn their Eagle badges and then not get them because he wouldn't fill out the paperwork on time or in time. People tried to get other people to take over the troop, but he would not stand for that. That was getting stabbed in the back. So he hung on to that troop, and that troop died and dissolved and was no more. So that story from my own life takes us into a very male realm. Boy Scouts, of course. But that's perhaps the power we're talking about, the active power. And again, it's a power in all of us. I don't want anyone to be excluded. These powers, we're complicated, right? We've got the moon and sun inside of us. We are a blend, a spectrum, a mosaic, a puzzle. All of us are. Include all these things. But I think of that. I think of my time in corporate America, temping for those places. I think of corporate America in general. No offense, corporate America, but like a big giant. Accomplishment, achievement, we do all that. They do all that well in some ways. But the life of feeling, the life of emotions, of water and darkness is hard for a big outfit, a big institution to access. Like I say, the examples just come flooding in, but another one I would think of is my time in Yosemite National Park, working as a park ranger there. And again, seeing a large institution, the Park Service, which does many wonderful things, but seeing their failure in the face of things like forest fire, for example, a wildfire which came, and just seeing all the classic reactions, the older brother reactions, if we can use the language of this story, which are, we have this under control, everything is fine, you'll be all right, listen to us, listen to the authorities, We'd get these wonderful reports saying the fire was 2% contained, emphasizing the containment of the fire and not emphasizing that it's 98% out of control. And simply giving a number to a fire, of course, is necessary for an institution like that. But again, that's a move from the yang side of us, the achievement side, the older brother riding that strong horse through the forest. I was there once and there was a fire coming and we all wondered about it. And the head ranger came and explained to the other rangers that we had at least 2 weeks before we might even possibly have to evacuate. He said he'd been all around the fire. He'd been in a helicopter. He'd seen it. He knew what was going on with it. We had 2 weeks to go, at least, until any evacuation might even be possible. I was a good ranger, innocent, like the youngest son, perhaps, who tells his brothers everything. And I believed that, and I told that to the people in the park who I met. He told that to us on Friday. 2 days later, Sunday morning, the part of the park we were in was crawling with emergency people, and everyone said, out by noon, as fast as you can, take everything with you. So I think of examples like that, because this is a story in many ways about the failure of the yang, masculine-flavored part of ourselves and the need to connect with water and feeling and shadows and darkness, which are to be found in the castle which is far away, where the water of life waits to heal the kingdom. Thank you for listening to this story, and perhaps you can find yourself in it somewhere. I hope so, because it is a map. And we don't want to be trapped in stories, but we're not trapped. We're in many stories all at once, of course. And a story can be like a map that guides us through parts of our lives. If you feel stuck, as we all do, I've felt stuck, of course. Of course! It's part of being human. Perhaps this story can help you think of a way forward through the life of feeling, perhaps. Thanks for listening to this story. And part 2 is coming up. Take care. There's more info and more stories at my website, jayleeming.com. Take care and all the best.